Professor Fletcher. Oh, and remind everybody that this is being recorded, which I think you should have just gotten a reminder. Professor Fletcher is a professor of public affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has appointments in sociology, applied economics, and population health sciences as well. As I think a lot of you know, his research focuses on examining social network effects on adolescent education and health outcomes, combining genetics and social science research, and estimating long-run consequences of childhood conditions, as well as child and adolescent mental health policy. And actually his work crosses a lot of other areas as well. Professor Fletcher serves as the director of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Center for Demography of Health and Aging, the executive director of the Wisconsin Research Data Center. He's an affiliate of the Center for Demography and Ecology, the Institute for Research on Poverty. He's a research associate at the MBR and the Institute for the Study of Labor, ISA. He's a member of the Scholars Strategy Network and the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Group at the University of Chicago. And I know we've all read a lot of his papers, which have appeared in outlets such as the Review of Economics and Statistics, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, JPAM, the Journal of Health Economics and Demography. And he also has a recent book called The Genome Factor, what the Social Genomics Revolution reveals about ourselves, our history, and our future, published by Princeton University Press. So we're thrilled to have him here. It's a really interesting paper on mortality and its relationship between state of birth and state of residence. We're having a graduate student session. So graduate students, please stay on at 1 o'clock, and from 1 to 1:30, you can chat with Professor Fletcher. We'll do the question and answer session. Professor Fletcher doesn't mind taking questions during the talk, but it may be easier to write your questions in the chat, and I'll read them to him at the end of the session. Okay, so if everyone can move themselves, Jason, take it away.
Progress.
Perfect. Pink, everything looks good on your end?
Looks great.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and for Pinka for the invitation. Very happy to show some new work that I'm doing that's not related to networks or genetics and other interests. On this case, it's geography, and so I'm saying hello from Madison here. My office is here, although it doesn't look exactly like this today, as you might imagine. And coming from Syracuse, the lake's a little bit different looking. I'll first make some general acknowledgements. This has been a great team effort for the last few years of examining old age mortality and place-based determinants of old age mortality. It's an interdisciplinary team, as you can see, and also want to make this clear that this is both U.S. Census data, and I'm working with U.S. Census collaborators, and part of the work has been supported by the NIA and the center. So setting the stage a bit, just more of a reminder, I think this group is well versed on much of what I'll be talking about today, but just orders of magnitude of the state-based disparities in mortality in the US. So you can think of 7.5 or so years difference across states when you think about the min and the max. And then there's even more if you add it on as you go below the state level into counties. And I'll set this up a little bit further with some figures that you've no doubt seen often, which is both the US's role in the world as being a laggard for some of our colleagues in Europe, and that differences continue to make the US look quite a bit worse, so especially in the last few years. And then within the US, we have Jennifer's work showing some of these details of state by state trends. So this is one such picture where you see the 7-year difference in 2017, and makes the point that difference has increased over time. And I did like a 5-minute pushing these things together. Let me go back to this slide, which is just the point I wanted to make here, is that parts of the US look like rich European countries, and parts of the United States look like middle income countries. So we have a lot of variation across states. And another way we see, especially in the media, visualizations of these relationships are not always about levels, but about rankings. So I'm going to turn to that also a little bit later in the presentation, but to just further situate you that it's not just that there is variation in both levels and rankings, but you also see this picture you are probably familiar with about the South being quite different than the rest of the country and having quite a bit of concentrated low, high mortality, both in levels and in rankings. This is the similar picture back to levels with life expectancy at birth, 2018. Got a little arrow there to, because I'm going to come back to Florida. Florida, you know, it is in the South. Everyone, you know, of certain states as being particularly weird. I'm going to come back to Florida for that. But it's in the South, but it's also, it doesn't look like a lot of the deep South in terms of life expectancy. And I think our results are going to show a little bit about why that might be. So I'll come back to that. Others have dug deeper inside states. So this is Raj Chetty's work on the New York Times website, where it's within states, and it's making the additional point that I won't be able to say much about today, that it's not just where state at the state level, but within states, but and also about income differences within those places. So the title, I think, is the important part, that for the rich, geography doesn't matter so much, for the poor it does. So to segue what I'm going to be doing today, which is to focus on when in life courses states seem to matter, or to at least have us think a little bit more about all the figures I've already shown you, because we're kind of, we see them so often we might not think about what they are telling us. So that's where I'm going to be going the next few minutes, is to just regroup on when we look at life expectancy figures to you know, remind ourselves that in any given year, you know, luckily good for us that most deaths actually happen at much later in life in the United States. This is making this point that it wasn't always thus, that in 1950 there was a large you know, amount of infant and child mortality. And I'm going to hold on this to say, like in 1950, when you see these relatively high rates of death early in life, I think we could think to ourselves, well, who should get credit for that in terms of states? And it's probably the state that we see the mortality in. What my point is going to be today is that when we go over to this side of the graph, when we're talking about mortality experienced in ages 70 and 80 and 90, what state should get credit when for the long lives or short lives of the old age population? That's where I'm going today. So this is reminding us just this distribution and what it looks like now versus what it used to look like. So here's some key facts to keep in mind when making this argument, is that, of course, people move during their life, and almost every figure that you're ever going to see in the media, I think, gives full credit for long lives and short lives to where people die and not where people were born. And orders of magnitude, 1/3 of US adults die outside their state of birth. So this tells us that both states of death are important, because 2/3 of people die in their state of birth, but that there might be something more to look at, excuse me, because there's a set of people, approximately 1/3, who die outside of their state of birth. And those who die outside their state of birth are also not a random group of people, as we know that people who migrate are typically healthier and those who don't, but there's a lot of variation there. I don't want to make too bold of a claim about that. But the fact that they're not a random set is going to suggest that this could be consequential, this fact that people die in states that they weren't born in. So I think we should regroup on what these state maps and analysis based on these type of maps could tell us. So going back to this, the fact that most people who are dying in any given year in the United States are dying at old age, which is to say post-migration. And the claim for those of many of us on the call who, you know, are convinced of life courses mattering and early condition mattering, you know, we think about place affecting our health during our life course, and this health partly generated by our place of birth or place of early childhood. affecting whether or not we go somewhere else, so that we have this place to health, to place, and then to mortality tangle that we're, when we try to disentangle that to apportion credit and blame, I think we have a possibility of getting in trouble. I think this presents a challenge to linking policies in general terms to outcomes like life expectancy, because of this issue of timing of both which policies are affecting what parts of our life course, and then when these policies are enacted compared to whether we were even in that state when the policy was enacted. So that's where I'm going. So I'm going to start off here in Wisconsin to tell you like the boring story, which is Wisconsin is one of the better cases where it's hitting that 1/3 of people who are living in Wisconsin at a certain time and therefore are eligible to die in Wisconsin at a certain period of time. 1/3 of them are from somewhere else. 2/3 or so are born in Wisconsin, and it's also like the boring part is that going back 100 years, you don't see huge changes over time. Like there's this constant trouble of 1/3 of the people who die in Wisconsin are going to be born somewhere else, but that group of people actually hasn't changed a whole lot over time, especially when I compare it to a couple other states. So essentially, Wisconsin's getting credit for other Midwestern states, and whether these are good states to be born in or bad states to be born in. But that's a small story of the full story of deaths of Wisconsin. Let me go to New York, where you all are. I guess not all of you are. Well, let's see. You said Syracuse, Cornell, and Albany. So I guess, yes, you're all there. Slightly different, a little, depending on if we're excluding the non-native born or not. You could see some concern about like this set of non-native individuals who are dying in these, or who are residing in New York State in these different years, probably are from different countries of origin. So that's a story. But otherwise, kind of similarly boring to Wisconsin. Potentially, you could say that New York might be getting some credit for people who are born in other New England states, and then a lot of credit or decrement for people who aren't born in the United States, and that could be changing over time. But let's take states on the other end. Look at this mess. Here's Nevada. No one living in Nevada was born in Nevada, right? So we go to who should get, when we think about Nevada's life expectancy in a given year, and we're calculating people who die in Nevada in a given year, like none of them were born there. That's a trouble, right? And you see that you could just as well call the Nevada life expectancy California. There's almost as many Californians residing in Nevada here than those who are born in Nevada. So kind of interesting. And then just emerging crazy state of Florida, which is back in early 1900s, 2/3 back to kind of like Wisconsin, 2/3 were born in Florida. Others were born in other southern states, so Florida would be getting credit for Georgians and Alabama and other Southerners. But then over time, you see just a huge, now all of a sudden it's no longer Georgia, it's New England. It's New York and Pennsylvania and New England and Mid-Atlantic. And then this big set of people coming in from outside the U.S. And so you wonder, when you think about life expectancy for the state of Florida's getting a lot of credit for people who weren't born in Florida, I guess, or decrement. So that's where I'm going, is to then further examine these with data of mortality. So going back to this question, who should get credit when we make these maps, and skipping down, why don't we already know all this? And I think it's because a lot of surveys on health don't tell you where people were born. They tell you where people were, or at the time of survey. And to do the state by state, the state 50 by 50 matrix of people coming and going, you actually need quite a bit of data that's bigger than something like the health and retirement study, I think, to do this analysis in detail. So our team has been working on related topics recently. I'm going to just plug one, which is not quite big data. We have 100,000 people in the center data set of the National Longitudinal Mortality Study, and we do something a little similar, but we just ask if we use as predictors state of birth versus state of residence at later age, which one in a horse race wins, and it's actually state of birth for this particular sample and time period. So that's one building block into what we're going to do today, which is to dig into that with bigger data and a little bit more recent data. That bigger and more recent data is essentially the American Community Survey of 2008 linked with death records. So you have big is in the 4 million range, and this particular survey has state of birth information in it, which is required, and it's enough people presumably to examine these state to state flows of mortality experiences. So we have 300,000 deaths across different states. We're going to focus on 50 plus and then native born. We're working in other work, we're bringing in the foreign born because it's even, of course, more complicated than just 50 emerging state, 50 origin states. Now, it's restricted data. We're working directly with census collaborators. And I'll just say that I'll preview that many of your questions about could you do this, could you do that? My answer is going to be probably not, because we receive the data in aggregated form. We have mortality rates by age, sex, and states. But we are we face constraints on further stratifying these aggregate death rates, essentially. If we wanted to do so, of course, it's every state. So it's you divide it by 50, and then some people move states. 1/3 of them do, and then we have by sex of the respondent. So we're actually tied in further examining by education or race. So that will be two of your questions, I'm sure, just to preempt a little bit of that. So we're going to otherwise use standard demographic methods to calculate life expectancy at age 50. And then just make this very basic comparison that we're not aware of being in the literature, and then do some additional analysis of what do we get in terms of state variation and life expectancy at 50 when we compare states of birth with states of residence. So the answer first is for males is graphed here, which is we plotted each state, and if it lined up exactly, if it was inconsequential of doing the state of birth versus state of residence comparison, everything would line up on the 45. Of course, except for Wisconsin. Wisconsin turns out to be like an incredibly well-behaved state here. So Wisconsin is right on the line, and in most of the figures I'm going to show you this is going to be almost inconsequential issue for Wisconsin, but for a lot of other places it's not. So the R square on this line is 0.6. With 51 observations. If we kick out some of the worst offenders, the District of Columbia and Wyoming, R square is 0.75, and a little bit higher for women in each of those cases. So that's the first bit about just assessing how consequential it is in terms of you get something different if you do this analysis by state of birth versus state of residence, and you do. And the other order of magnitude to have in your head is the mean absolute deviation of these two differences. So state of birth minus state of residence, life expectancy differences is about half a year for men and about 0.4 years for women across the 51 years. I'll take a breath in case there's any questions here. We're going to now, the first figure was just aligning them up against the 45 degree. Now we're going to plot them in geographic space to see if it tells us anything about regional inequalities. So panel A I have here is what you would see in every other paper, which is state of residence based life expectancy, and then you plot it across the country, and you see this deep red in the south. And what we find is that if you do the same thing by state of birth, it actually makes the story quite a bit worse in the South, which is that migration over life courses removes some of the regional inequalities and mortality that are there. And our friend Florida here, you can see as being a little bit of an outlier on the left, but more like it's actually in the South on the right. So that's one finding. Is that in some sense that whatever disparities, regional disparities we're concerned on the figures on the left, which we would see in most other papers and in the media, it's actually a little worse than that if you think about state of birth as the type of geography we're interested in. And that the story of migration here is in part to reduce these regional inequalities. That's point one. I have a map here that's just essentially left minus right of those two to show you in a little bit more detail that that there's a spatial dimension of how these two measures differ, and all the states in green here they essentially like look better in all the papers and media than they would if we did state of birth, and all the places in red look worse. So that if you focus on state of birth, they actually would get more credit for being good places than they do in all the work that focuses on state of residence and state of death. So let me turn quickly to, instead of levels, the rankings just for a moment, because it's going to turn out to be even more consequential in rankings. That if you re-rank places not based on states where people die, but states where people are born, again, except for a few states like Wisconsin, again, the very well-behaved state who doesn't change their rank, all the rest of the states, get shuffled around quite a bit. 12 states change their ranked place by more than 10 spaces. So, a lot of the figures in the media about healthy places and so on, which focus on these rankings, it is actually consequential that they focus on rankings of where people are currently living or dying versus where they were born and lived their young life. So I'll turn for the next few slides on this obvious point of what's the explanation, and it's migration, but we're going to look at this in ways because we failed to find a simple story. So let me describe some of the simple stories that we didn't find, and then a little bit more complicated story that the data seemed to point us to. So of course, the difference between states of birth and states of death, life expectancy calculations must be that people have changed their category over their life, which is to say they migrated across states. And there's this question of just quantity of migrants, like some states might lose a lot of people, and then versus a small number of people, versus the characteristics of the migrants, which is to say some states might lose more of their healthier population than others. And in the first point, they both can be true, but all our evidence so far doesn't seem to suggest the first part, the quantity being the real issue. We actually, in several figures in the paper, we don't find any real relationship between states that are healthier versus not healthier being associated with people coming or going, essentially. So in terms of quantities, flows towards states that are healthier in general terms versus away from states that are unhealthy in general terms, we actually don't find much of that from a quantity perspective. So we're going to mostly dismiss that and move towards this possibility of the characteristics of migrants being different rather than just the gross or net flows between states. So I'm going to take another minute with this. There's a lot of information on this figure. So this is plotting every state in these quadrants in terms of well first we're calculating. Let me start over. We're calculating the life expectancies of stayers in every state, so non-migrants. We're calculating the life expectancy of people who move into each state. We're calculating the life expectancy of people who leave a state against, again, this calculation of people who stay in that state. Okay, so, and then we're plotting it all in one figure. So there's a lot here. So let's go to the biggest findings in some sense would be the green dots in the areas on the right-hand side of my cursor at 2 here. So these are places where the life expectancy of their in-migrants is over 2 years more than the life expectancy of the quote unquote native population, the people who have not left that state. So these are states where people coming in during their life course is moving the life expectancy of that state by a lot. let me say a different way, that the people coming in are quite different than the people who are the native population or people who were born from in that state. So that's the green, and you can see how concentrated this is in the South. So these are states where the in-migrants live a lot longer or live longer than the native non-moving population, the stayers. So also on this graph is the vertical axis, which is the states that have people who are leaving that look different than the people who remain. So you see that there's a lot more. So over on the states I'm describing over here, we're talking about differences of 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. There's nothing like that over here. Okay, the max here is 2, and so a place like Ohio, the life expectancy of people leaving Ohio is 2 years more than the people who remain, right? So that's part of the story of Ohio, and some of the Rust Belt are the people who are leaving go on to live longer lives than those who stay. And so these are all the quadrants, and what you see is that there's a set of states also where this doesn't matter very much, that the people coming in, the people coming out, like the state of Washington here is at 0 on both dimensions. So it doesn't, it's kind of a wash. They have people who are leaving who are essentially the same as stayers, and the people who are coming in, they're essentially the same as stayers in terms of their life expectancy. But these are the unusual states. For most states, this is more consequential. Going back to this point, especially in the South, we're getting these 2 to 4 year differences in life expectancy for the people coming in versus the people who were already there. Showing this in a slightly different way, I'm now focusing on a smaller set of states and just, again, showing what the patterns on life expectancy suggests in the data, which is that the stayers, green, they're kind of, for every state, the green is at the bottom or near the bottom of all these migrant groups, which is again consistent with this healthy migrant effect, which is the people who are leaving, who are coming and going, have higher life expectancy than the people who don't move, who die in their state. And that's true. So which is to say, this green line is the lowest line or the lowest dot in every case except for Ohio. But we do have these different experiences where when we think about the composite, when we start adding together the people migrating in versus and the people who have stayed, you take a case like Virginia, where the people coming in have quite a bit higher life expectancy than the people who were the always stayers or who were born there. And then we have a little difference in the people who left. So these 3 lines are just showing, like for Virginia, we have healthy people leaving, but we have even healthier people coming in and replacing them, is like the short version of that. And so on this side, we have states that have look better with common measurements of state of residence being the life expectancy measurement versus state of birth. And for these states, and of course, these are the southern states again, and for the states on the left, those are states where using state of birth as the metric, these states look better. And again, you have these similar things where people moving out of Pennsylvania have higher life expectancy than the stayers in green, and that's not being covered up by the people who are moving out of Pennsylvania, or just look like the people who stayed in Pennsylvania. So sorry, let me start over with Pennsylvania. The people leaving Pennsylvania, moving out, have higher expectancy than people who have remained. And that's not being undone by the people who come in red, who look just like the stayers. So, we have essentially like these 50 case studies of what's happening in terms of people coming in and people leaving versus the stayers, but the stayers are always and have lower life expectancy than those migrant groups. I'll stop now for a minute if there's anything on that before I move to counterfactuals.
Jason, there are 2 questions in the chat. Do you want me to read those to you?
Sure.
Okay, the first one, June Lee, are you able to get data on the length of time that a person spent in their birth state? And do you think there is variation in the length of stay by birth state?
So the first part, we can't for our data. This is a real challenge. I mean, I would point people to a real good step forward with something like the health and retirement study, where for a subset, they're going back and every state these people have lived in through self-report. But that's really uncommon. Like if either there's data sets like the Wisconsin longitudinal study that have the whole life course in one study and you can figure out where they've lived. But for a lot of data sets, so those are the unusual data sets. For the other data sets that we would typically use, we know where the person was surveyed. Sometimes we know where they were born, but we almost never know anything else. And so this is a really important point that you're raising about what we would like to know. The second part of your question is, could we even calculate the typical experiences by state? I think it would have to be something like the health and retirement study, or something that's a little bit more synthetic, where you add together migration flows from states to states and just created cohorts and see what they, probabilistically look like. I think you could do that too. Good questions.
And the next question is from Andrew London. I think he's talking about figure 5. Is that really interesting? Yeah, that one. He says people may move and then return, right? They might appear to be stayers.
That's the other thing that we can't do. These are, so yeah, we except to acknowledge it. So you should have this in mind. I think our general view is that understates our results, but it's probably not going to be true for every state. It's a good point. Again, I mean, I think this is really the first point, and this is really what I think I've learned from this project, is how much more we need to, bring in and migration experts and people whose main focus is exactly this. Like this is nothing new probably for them, that the limitation that data sets don't have these good migration histories. This is just another example of that. I'm sure they're already convinced, but to somehow bring them in to fix this would be very nice. Do you want, should I take Doug too?
Oh, sure, I didn't see Doug. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Jason, you've presented a tremendous amount of information, and you probably presented the answer to what I'm about to ask. But when you make these comparisons of life expectancy, state of birth versus state of residence after a move, I guess, are they all period measures, and are they all the same period?
They are. Thank you, Doug. So they are. Let me just go back to, so the data set, the way it works is that it's the state that everyone lived in the 2008 American Community Survey. And subsequent to that, there's a 7-year mortality follow-up to the National Death Index. So everyone's exposure window is the same, 7 years, and everyone's measurement of where they were living is in 2008. In 2008, we also have a measurement of what state they were born in. So yes, on the period point, but it's essentially the same calculation where you switch what the geography is. Is it state of residence, and you calculate that in a standard way, or you put people together based on their state of birth and you calculate life expectancy at 50 in the standard way. Does that help?
Yeah, well, what I'm really getting at is I may be missing something really key to how your analysis works. Is there some sense in which is there a way to, is it the case that when people move from a low life expectancy state to a higher life expectancy state, do those movers somehow, even mechanically, get a benefit from that in terms of an increased residual lifetime for them? I mean, is that something that can be backed out of what you're doing, or is it just too complicated?
I'm going to show you an attempt to do that. So you're asking a great question, which is essentially like trying to further decompose the possibility of actually gaining, you know, gaining longevity based on where you move to. That there are causal place effects in late life. So I will come to that in the next slide. I'll preview to say that, you know, we're going to try our best, but we don't have any leverage here of like, unlike other papers, we have very little leverage, I think, about, you know, looking at quasi-experimental variation and where people move and this kind of thing. We're going to just take the data and do some assessments of place. I won't ruin the next couple slides. I'll show you what we do in the counterfactuals. Then I see a hand up with Erin. Could you unmute?
Thank you. So I am just kind of wondering about those states like New York and Pennsylvania, where the life expectancies are similar for the people who stayed and the people who moved in. Do you think that that says anything about the state, or is it just about the people who moved? Like, I'm wondering, like, does it mean that the state, for example, maybe in New York, which is a higher life expectancy state, does a better job of creating like a healthful environment such that the people that moved in are able to reflect like a life that is more similar to the people that have stayed there long term?
Perfect. And it's like I take that point, and it's you know, an offshoot or an addition of what Doug was asking, which I think I take what one product that we're going to do is to like take these points on the graph like I'm showing you, where you could then take these and I think answer and do a better job answering that question by taking these estimates and like moving them into the health and retirement study and asking that question, like how, because in our data, we have a cross section of where people were and what their characteristics were in 2008. And the only thing we know about them later is when and if they die. Okay, so there's no extra like, did they quit smoking or did they change jobs? That has to be done with other data. And I really think that, Erin, you're bringing up a great like next step, which is to take some of these patterns and ask whether you see in other data sets that people seem to be behaving differently in these states based partly on these patterns, like in a way that's consistent with these patterns and consistent with the story you're telling, which is, again, just to ask whether there are causal place effects in late life and what those look like in the behaviors of people who are living there. And separately, which is something we can't disentangle very well, whether it's just that people have different characteristics who moved to Pennsylvania versus New York versus South Carolina, and that's what's happening with these point estimates. They're just like different people who have different life expectancies because they have different characteristics themselves. And we have a limited amount of information that we could try to decompose that. I think that would be with other data sets. Scott, I see your hand up too.
Yeah, Jason, hopefully this will be a quick methodological question. So you've got state of residence and as of 08 from the ACS, right? And so you've got state of death from the death certificate, is that okay? And the state of birth you also have from the death certificate. Is that correct? Or do you have
we have state of birth for everybody, but I don't know the answer to whether we have state of birth twice, which is one in the ACS and one through the death records.
Gotcha. Okay. So someone who in 08 in the ACS is living in New York and dies in 2019 in California, you're reclassifying them as a migrant to California, correct or not?
We did that. There's not very much of that in our data. We've done it both ways, and we're showing the way that you're describing where you do the reclassification. There's actually not a lot of, so it's within that 7-year period, there's not a lot of changes. So we tried it both ways, but we're doing it the way that you would do based on death certificates, which is what state did they die in, even if they moved in the last 7 years.
Okay, so that's what I was asking. So your final state of death is based on the death certificate data, not the ACS 2008 state. Okay, all right, thank you.
But we've done it both ways because what you're bringing up is that for non-decedents, we don't know what state they're in 2015.
Correct.
So we need to do a little both ways about how consequential that lack of information is. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
So let me, in a little bit of time, describe a couple of our counterfactuals, which is to say, and try to be as clear as I can about what we're punting on and what we're not. so because these are two counterfactuals of many that one could do, and we've tried to only do a few. So I think the key issues, or we think that as a group, we think the key issues in terms of like why we're seeing what we're seeing are that in general, migrants are healthier, are going to have longer life expectancy. And so that's one element. And then this is what Doug and Aaron brought up about the possibility of destination place effects, which is to say, when I move from one state to the other, my destination state might causally affect my life expectancy. So we want to entertain that. And the purposeful migration towards healthy places aspect, right? So those are three issues, and we're going to, when I said we're going to punt versus focus, we're going to punt on healthy migrants versus non-migrants. We're just going to allow / recognize that that's part of our data, that it appears that migrants in general are healthier than the people who stay. So we're not going to shut that off or turn that on. We're going to shut off and turn on the next two, which is to say we're going to take the group of people who move out of their state of birth and we're going to start shuffling them in different ways. We're not going to allow them to go to where they actually went. We're going to shuffle them to look a little bit closer about the place effects of health and in particular the purposefulness of migration towards healthy places. So the idea is to fix the number. Like I said, we're going to take this bucket of people who leave their states of birth and we're going to assign them to states. And we're going to do this assignment in two ways. So we retain the healthy migrant effect and we're going to turn off and on the second two things. I'll come back to this. It's hard to turn off purposeful migration. Maybe I'll try to say the issue once and maybe come back to it. What we're going to rely on is that some states are more popular than others for having people migrating in. Part of that popularity might be because of this purposeful, like health-related selection. So we're going to turn off parts of that, which is to say that we're going to take all the migrants and we're going to randomly, we're going to assign them to states that they didn't necessarily actually go to. So that's shutting down their individual match to a particular state and whether they purposely went to this state because it would be great for them, maybe. But we're not going to shut down entirely the fact that maybe Florida has more migrants than Alabama, and that might be because Florida is a good place effect of health destination. Okay, so that's a lot. I'll retain this 0.61 on each slide, but the cross-state standard deviation in this difference. The difference is the difference between life expectancy of residence versus birth. We know that for every state, or we can calculate for that for every state. The standard deviation of that metric is 0.61 years. And that's how we're going to evaluate the counterfactuals, by how that moves around as we shut down different parts of the process. So 0.61, I'll show again in the next slide up top. Now, whoops, that's my second scenario. First scenario is that how do we assign migrants? We assign them based on popularity of the destination. So we take the bucket of people who leave their state and we allocate them based on how many migrants go to that state in general terms. So we're not placing people in the state they actually migrated. We're just assigning probabilities to these states based on the quote unquote popularity. Okay, so second part of that is that we either allow for these destinations to affect their life expectancy causally, or we do not allow that. If we do not allow that, so that's first scenario A, no place effects of destination, you're assigned to your destination based on the popularity of that destination. Here's the figure from above. So above the standard deviation life expectancy difference, mouthful is 0.61. That's reduced down to 0.5 if we shut down both of those at the same time. If we allow place effects of destination to enter back in, again, migrants aren't selecting that, we're shuffling them around based on popularity. But if we allow that the places that are popular for migrants do have causal effects on their health, then the difference goes down to 0.38 in this difference, the standard deviation of life expectancy difference, which is to say that about 25% here and about 35% here of the difference across states in the standard deviation of this measurement is attributed to unrandom sorting, right? So the thing that we're shutting down we're making it random. So the rest of it is the non-random sorting of migrants to different locations. So that's a mouthful. We do one more tweak of that, which turns out to not matter. So I'll just say it very quickly, which instead of doing the popularity point, we just do a uniform likelihood of going to one state versus the other. So instead of like, if Florida is really popular, it would get more migrants in this first scenario. Even if it's popular in the second scenario, it gets the same number as every other state. So going down to the final, you see this is essentially the same as the last. So it's not really this popularity point that seems to matter as much. It's actually this, purposeful selecting of where we're going is this bulk of what's left over. It's attributed to the non-random sorting of particular migrants from particular places to particular places. When we shut down these other broad elements, that's only about a third of the story. So we're so that actually gets us a little stuck because we need different data to focus on what's left, like individual people with their individual characteristics going from one place to the other throughout their life. I think that's where you need NLSY 79, HRS, other data sets that track people across a bigger set of their life course and see if people from certain states go to others in a way that seems related to what we're describing here, like in this purposeful way. So I'll wrap up with this summary, which is that we do this simple analysis in terms of, it's the typical thing. You take where people die and ask and calculate life expectancy at 50, and then you just do one change. Instead of looking at where people die, you look at where people were born, and you ask, is that consequential? And we find it to be consequential for many reasons, but I think one of the top findings is about regional inequalities, that the way we construct geographic disparity measures now based on where people move to and die actually hides geographic disparities that are present at birth. That migration actually undoes some of the geographic disparities at birth because of where people are migrating and what happens to them after they migrate. It has this difference has a modest effect on state levels, which is to say state levels of life expectancy. So at a level, it's about a half a year on average difference between one calculation and the other. For rankings, the way we do rankings, it's really consequential because most states are kind of similar. They're within a year or two of every other state. And when you switch states around by about half a year, it really moves them in some cases like DC to a completely different part of our rankings. So it can be consequential for some things like rankings. It would be interesting to do these same type of analyses for not mortality, but for other health behaviors. We find some evidence that in migrants matter a lot, that there's this healthy migrant effect, and then they go to places in a non-random way that then really helps some states more than others. And the big headline is to go back to when we do analyses where we're trying to explain state level disparities in life expectancy at a period of time. I think we do need to be interested in and think about more what it's doing to our analysis that people who die in a state that might have just moved there and at least spent some of their life in a different state, getting different policy effects and getting different health effects that we just totally must lose sight of if we're doing the standard analysis. One preview before, let's see, yeah, I have a few minutes, is, well, this is all states. It'd be great to do more with counties. And so Hamid, one of the postdocs I'm working with here, is doing some first sets of work where just asking descriptively, like if you go back to, let me situate this as the United States by county. If we go back to 1940 full count census, and we place everyone in their counties of residence in 1940, this is whites to get to not have to deal, to not, well, just to be clear who it is, this is the white subsample in 1940. And as you'll remember, this is mostly before the great migration of African Americans. proportion of residents in 1940 who died in a different state in these years. And you see, you see some geographic differences across states, but then, you can certainly see areas within states where things are like really different than their neighboring counties. Like there's a big mess of Texas where no one, died in a different state who was born in East Texas or Central Texas versus even neighboring states. So I think that there's going to be some interesting discoveries from going within state and seeing how different, some of these looks are. Let's see, and the other one is the reverse, which is taking where people die and asking the proportion of deaths among those who resided in a different state. So these are where everyone dies, and saying what proportion of people moved into that place, what proportion of people were from a different state compared to the county they died in, not just the state. And again, you can see a lot of geographic variation even within state. Like look at Florida down here, where a huge proportion of people who died in recent times were in a different state in 1904, but there's even within state variation where it's huge in the southern part of Florida, but more modest in the northern part of Florida. Just a couple of examples, and I'll conclude there and ask for more questions. And thank you for your thoughts.
Jason, just to let you know, you've got a couple things in the chat, and then you've got 2 hands up. So maybe we'll do the hands first and then the chat.
Please, Shannon.
Hi, thanks, Jason. You covered a ton of content there. Super interesting. My question is a question that I think Jennifer would ask you if she were here. So all credit to this question goes to Jennifer, because we've talked about this before. So what you have in your sample, right, are people who are 50 years old by 2008, which means that they would have been born between the late 40s and early 50s, right? So at that period, is it possible, well, we know that state contexts were much more similar than they are now. So in other words, there was far less variation in mortality across states in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and state policies were more similar and really started to diverge in the 1980s onward. So that's sort of one piece of where I'm going. The second is for these people who were born in the late 40s, early 50s, now we're approaching the period of the Great Migration, where you're going to get a lot more migration during the next couple of decades than we're experiencing now in more recent decades in the United States. And so I'm just wondering about how that may change your findings if you were, for example, to fast forward everything 40 years. And now you're running the same analysis where you're looking at people who were born in like 1980 or 1990 and differences in life expectancy for state of birth versus state of residence. I'm just wondering how the historical period that you're capturing really matters here.
I agree with these points, but I take a lot of your points to say it's worse than what we're showing, essentially, which is to say that if you thought that by worse, I mean that it's more consequential, then like we're showing some cases maybe that is less consequential because of these policy differences or something, but that if there's more, what we're not being able to see through some of the so let me back up. It's really, we're trying to do more here, but we really need to distinguish in these analysis the results by race, exactly because of the Great Migration, right? For people who are moving between, say, 1940 and 1970, we just can't do that with our data in the restricted environment that we're in. Unfortunately, right now, we're trying to get around that. But I guess I don't know maybe where to take your question, which is to say that, like, I think my stance is more, we should think about the measurement of state of birth. I don't see a limitation of doing that. Like, I think that's going to be an informative measure of life expectancy based on state of birth, and it's a measure that we essentially never use. But I'd be willing to be like corrected there, because we're looking for times of academic articles or media accounts where the metric of health and place, like state, is based on states where people were born or had their early childhood. My sense is that it's always based on where they're residing as adults. Is that, I don't know if you could correct that, or if you share that view.
No, I think that's totally true. I mean, I think the challenge you have that you've not acknowledged is that, we have no idea how long these people lived in their state of birth versus state of residence. It's entirely possible that with the Great Migration, you had a whole bunch of parents just picking up and leaving after their kid was like just born or 1 or 2 years. Conversely, then they could have lived in their state of death for the next 50 years, 48 years. And in that case, we would probably think that state of death was more consequential because they had more exposure to that state. So, this is obviously a huge step in a direction that we have no information on. And I hope that the data availability improves, options for controlling for duration of residence in both state of birth and, like where you move throughout the rest of your life, not just where it starts and where it ends. But thank you. Tons of info here.
But picking that up, I agree with what you said, Shannon, but I also would just add something that but just to add to everyone else is that that this exposure variable that we would love to have so much is, I think it would point to how much variation across states there are. Like this, Florida is so crazy here. And the Great Migration wasn't uniform either. It wouldn't be that everyone who moved in the Great Migration uniformly went to every other state, and therefore it's not going to matter. The Great Migration was from very specific states to very specific states. Again, I think it would complicate these questions of treating all the states and all the lengths of exposure the same, which is what we're doing now, unfortunately. Doug.
Thank you. This is a really impressive body of work that you're building, and it's provocative in a great way because it suggests all kinds of questions. Now, my question is, you referred many times to purposive migration. And it makes me want to ask you if you're working on or thought about trying to embed this health and life expectancy dimension into a model of destination choice. I did some work years ago modeling county to county flows as though they were the consequence of a, kind of a rational choice model where costs and benefits were weighed against each other. And one specific thing that occurs to me from listening to you is, well, you talked about Florida being an anomaly, and you also talked about healthy migrant effect, but it could be that healthier people than average go to Florida because housing prices are higher, and people who have more resources to spend on housing are healthier. It's the issue is sorting out the sort of individual factors that drive location choice and the contextual factors that make some destinations not only more attractive than others, but more possible or less costly than others. And it's a complicated picture, but it's sort of fascinating to imagine putting that all together.
So I think that's where we're trying to go. We are limited, unfortunately, with data. You start with what you would love, which would be life course migration questions, like having measurements pre-migration, in say young childhood or young adulthood, and then seeing what happens to these people as the respondents as they move into old age. And you can start seeing how you're shrinking the data sets that are possible. Like HRS, you start when they're 50, you know where they're born, but you don't know everywhere they were, and you definitely don't know what their health was like before they started. Right? Or so NLSY, you know where they started, but they're not quite old enough to be fully, at high risk of mortality. But you could imagine piecing these things together. So, which is all to say that I think our analysis here could serve as some inputs to those type of analyses, because our data has, for going back to your point about these are period measures, which is a limitation, but we are separately measuring some of these quantities that might be of interest, which is the life expectancy for people who stayed in each state versus people who came into each state versus people who left for each state. Those are the type of inputs you could then ask the model of migration choice you're describing about. When we see someone moving from Texas to Kentucky, how can we tell if they're moving to a healthier state? we have to have some of these inputs to figure out what the life expectancy of different types of people are in that state to even say if that's a healthy move or a non-healthy move, right? So that's where we're trying to go, but we have these issues that we're going to have to, get little bits of this at a time, I think, and not have one paper that solves it all, unfortunately. But that's where we are, about the little papers that are going to chip away at it. Thanks for that question, Doug.
Jason, I think we'll have to, you actually have some really interesting comments and questions in the chat, but I think we have to move to the student session now. So I just want to thank Professor Fletcher. I thought that was a fantastic session, and we had such great comments from the audience. At this time, can students who want to participate in the session from 1 to 1:30 stay on, and everybody else can drop off? Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. That was wonderful.
Jason, we'll just give them a couple minutes to drop off. That was awesome. I had a lot of questions for you, but I didn't want to